All right, on to the second part of my Thunder Rift overview, the history of Thunder Rift. Now, a long time ago, in a time that is left ambiguous because the way the storyline was created was to be generic and to be fit into any sort of world that you, as the DM, decide to create, the Thunder Rift was populated by elves and dwarves. No humans were here at this time. During that time, both of the races didn't really have any real reason to come in conflict with each other. They generally got along because they didn't have to deal with each other. Neither party wanted to take the lands of the others. Now, as time goes on, maybe years, maybe decades, maybe centuries, it depends on whatever you decide to do. These two races eventually started coming into conflict with each other. Minor disagreements start devolving into larger disagreements. Then whole families get involved, and they bring their friends. Just like normal life. It's like the Hatfields and the McCoys, except for this time it's dwarves and elves. Now, as these feelings of mistrust and dislike grew over the years, they eventually turned into hatred for each other, and then this eventually devolved into the younger members of each of the races staging guerrilla raids on the other members. And then this eventually devolved into an all-out war between the dwarves and elves. This war was referred to as the Rift Wars. I'm guessing it says wars at the end of it because it was a series of small wars, however it doesn't really expand on it. Now, during this war, the elves, armed with their powerful magics, reduced multiple dwarven fortresses to rubble, and their skilled archers also decimated dwarven defenses in the forest. Now, the dwarves, not being ones to give up and as stubborn as they are, continue to fight back, and their favorite tactic was to start burning the forest, causing the elves to run out of the forest as it burns down, and then slaughter the elves that come out of the woods. But suffice to say that both the races fought a pretty brutal war against each other. Now, of course, as evil races are known to do, the orcs and goblins were not just sitting on the sidelines for this, watching the two races sit there and murder each other during their little war. The orcs and goblins decided to capitalize on it. They would raid villages full of the young, the helpless, and the old, and proceed to slaughter all of them. This just further inflamed the wars between the elves and the dwarves because they thought that each other were doing this. They weren't just killing each other's warriors, no, they were instead also going for the families and everybody else they were trying to protect. It took a while for the elves and dwarves to figure out this was not the case. They had continued killing each other pretty brutally. And this would have continued if not for the case of a single elven child had escaped the carnage of one of the orc raids and told his rescuers of the monsters that actually committed the war crimes. With this new knowledge, the elves went out under a flag of truce and met with the dwarves and informed them of what had actually been going on, and both races, understandably enraged, decided they were going to set aside their differences and deal with their common enemy, the orcs. Their combined forces were enough to crush the mighty hordes of the evil humanoids, and they fled into the burning hills and hid in the deepest holes they could find. And thus did the First Rift War end, with the almost complete decimation of the dwarven and elven races, and the almost complete annihilation of the orcs in the region. The dwarves and elves, with their populations equally depleted, withdrew from the war-torn plains and went deep into the mountains for the dwarves and the forests for the elves to recuperate themselves. Now, this is the part where both of the races created their racial capitals. The dwarves withdrew to the Feralis Hills, where they may end up making Hearthhome, and the elves withdrew into the southern portion of the Gauntlet Forest. Now, the whole time this was happening, there was also halflings. However, the halflings had nothing to do with the war and apparently played Switzerland and did not get involved. Because of this, even though the elves and dwarves did not really want to have contact with each other and pretty much still despised each other but didn't want to continue killing each other, the only contact between the two races was done by the intermediaries of the halflings, because that's the only people they would talk to. Because I guess when you live for hundreds of years, you hold grudges for pretty long too. It was at the end of this Rift War that humanity eventually found its way into the Rift. Humanity apparently found the natural splendor of the Rift to their liking and began to settle there. They founded several towns and began to work to bring the Rift under their control. Castles were built, wizards found various parts to their liking, and built their own special towers, and humanity found great wealth in the area and were determined to exploit it to its fullest extent. Now, eventually, with humanity running wild all over the place, they eventually ran into the other three races, the elves, the dwarves, and the halflings. First meetings with each one of these races was distant because each one of them were worried that this may end up devolving into a whole new Rift War. However, though they may have been correct, it was not humanity's fault the next Rift War began. While everybody was running around being too scared of each other, the goblins had decided to repopulate themselves in the Burning Hills, and the orcs sitting over there near the Feralis Hills decided they were going to start attacking the dwarves. The goblins in the Burning Hills decided they were going to go back into the forest because they're green, I guess. They're green, so they like the woods, right? Now, humanity, as much as the other races may not like them, is about the only thing that saved each of the races from being destroyed. Left on their own without the humans there, the elves would have sat back and watched as the orcs eventually killed off the dwarves, and the dwarves would have sat back and watched as the goblins eventually killed off all the elves. But thanks to humanity and also its number of people, humanity decided to assist each of the races in defending themselves. And since they did this, they formed an alliance with each of the good races in the Rift. Humanity, elves, dwarves, and halflings. This alliance was able to once again defeat the evil monsters of the orcs and goblins and push them back into their deep dark holes where they belong. And with that, victory was found, and the dwarves, elves, and halflings were thankful to humanity for helping save the Rift altogether. This did little to lessen the animosity that the elves and dwarves felt towards each other, but active plotting against each of the other races had ceased at this point. Well, mostly. There still was probably some little stuff. The book also adds on that even today, in your current timeline, they still live strictly apart from each other, avoiding contact if at all possible. And when they do meet, they are often brusque and rude to each other. Now, after the Second Rift War, there was a period of general peace in the Rift. It doesn't say how long, however, the book does say through the years kingdoms rose and fell. Refugees from the Wars of Succession outside the Thunder Rift came to the valley. Dispossessed knights, master thieves, powerful clerics, and assorted mages also came to Thunder Rift. They built villages on the ruins of old towns. Some of these villages prospered, while others failed miserably. A few made their livelihood by raiding the goods produced by other villages, and there were even some who negotiated with goblins and orcs. Now, I'm not exactly the smartest man anywhere, but I would guess with that description, we're probably talking not just like years here, but we're probably talking at least decades, if not over a century. Now, this general time of peace ended when a strange plague struck the valley. This plague was a little bit weird because it swept through the villages of humans into the burrows of halflings, under the trees of the elven forest, and into the craggy fortresses of the dwarves. And despite the best efforts of the healers of all the races, much of the population of Thunder Rift died and rotted away. Even more strangely, evil creatures were not affected by the plague. Indeed, the disease appeared to make these evil creatures stronger for a time. Now, being the geniuses they are, this led to each of the races to come to the conclusion that, maybe a wizard of evil power had assisted the vile monsters in their cause. And once again, humanity comes to save everyone else. The best and brightest of humanity's clerics gathered their spells and prayers and cast their wills into the preservation of their allies. And many of these clerics actually slipped into exhaustion and also into death as their magic and spiritual efforts finally triumphed, and they were able to remove the plague from the rift, and the allies, the dwarves, humans, and elves, were once again able to drive off the orcs and goblins and send them back into the stinking holes they belong in. I would refer to this probably as the Third Rift War, and after this war, the dwarves and elves retreated back to their own communities to rebuild, and humanity and the halflings also rebuilt their communities, but they actively petitioned for settlers outside the rift to move in. The end of the Third Rift War also led to the Council of the Isle. It contained representatives from all four of the races and was founded to discuss the collective future of Thunderrift. They met on Mage Island, and on this island, the four honorable delegates of the four concerned races laid the groundwork for a lasting peace. They wished to ensure that the Rift Wars, at this point there's been 3 of them, would never occur again, and all of them understood that it would be quite some time before the dwarves and elves would be able to live in harmony, but they were resolved to provide a foundation for a lasting accord. As a symbol of this new forged peace, the council ordered the establishment of a group of heroes, a party that would travel throughout the rift and dedicate itself to the disruption of the forces of chaos. Each of the 4 races was commanded to send 1 or 2 of its most notable champions to this party, effective immediately. The dwarves and the elves were unenthusiastic at this, but soon the very best of each of the races began to vie for the honor of representing their people. Eventually a selection was made, and there was 6 members of this group. Representing the dwarves was a Tharagat Orcsblood, a distinguished warrior. The elves provided their best archer/wizard, the Sandria Starshine. The humans offered 2 champions, a cleric and a thief, Father Patrius Timoris, and the sneaky Grey Raven. And finally, the famed halfling twins Corian and Dorian came from their hilly burrows to lend their nimble, short swords to the cause. 6 heroes altogether. Now, with most new things that are ever created, acceptance of it is not instantaneous. The heroes went about the rift doing what heroes are supposed to do. They completed multiple quests and completed many tasks that were given to them, and throughout all these quests, each of the champions strove to understand each other and learn how to work together. The 2 who got along the best, oddly enough, were Tharagat, the dwarf, and Thasandria, the elf. After many exploits, the heroes were able to finish off their last final epic quest, which was a fight against a dragon at Torlin. At this fight, Grey Raven, the thief, and Corian, one of the halfling twins, died defending Thasandria. However, their sacrifice allowed Thasandria to finish the worm with a well-placed spell. With much ceremony and honor, the 4 survivors were established as the quadrille, the generals of the rift. Since then, as members of the quadrille have retired or perished, the council has replaced them with the best of the young explorers in the rift. Now, there is only 1 member from each race as part of the quadrille. So there's always 1 human, 1 elf, 1 dwarf, and 1 halfling. And they are the best of their race. A little bit of a note here. If you guys do end up creating your own quadrille for players to run into, if you're running Thunder Rift, he should probably, or she, should probably be around level 10. Because if you look to the different modules that are based in Thunder Rift, you'll find that some NPCs are level 7, 8, or 9. So if you're going to be representing the best that are found in the Rift, you probably should be a little bit higher than that. So 10 sounds like a good one. Now, do you guys remember the part where I said that Thurgot and Thessandria got along amazingly well? Well, that continued after they retired from the quadrille. The two actually decided to bridge the gap between dwarves and elves by announcing their marriage engagement to each other. Now, as happy as that sounds, obviously, members of both races did not like this plan at all. But alas, they were forced to deal with it because they were not going to give up on each other. They had a lavish marriage. All the most important representatives from the entire Thunder Rift were there, and there were no outbreaks of violence between the more conservative attendees, though several insults were coolly exchanged between them. Now, as Thessandria and Thurgot were expecting their first child, don't ask me how that works. I am not a biologist, and I'm not a fantasy biologist either. Treachery happened. The couple was found brutally slaughtered in their home, and ironically, the evidence points to a dwarf-elfin conspiracy combined, but all the investigations were fruitless. Nevertheless, the brutal murder of a father, mother, and unborn child united the old adversaries, elf and dwarf, in a sense of mutual shame, and since then, all formal hostilities between the dwarves and elves have ceased. But as mentioned earlier, they still don't like each other. Since dwarves and elves are now not killing each other, the rift should, return back to peace, right? There shouldn't be any more big rift wars. Well, that's where we're wrong, because humanity is still involved in this. In the years that followed, the elves and dwarves ceasing all formal hostilities, humanity established a fighters' academy in the Rift and also a wizards' academy. The fighters' academy was referred to as the fighters' academy because that's extremely creative, and the wizards' academy was known as the Wizard Spire, since it was located atop a peak in a small group of mountains that pierced the great grasslands. Now, clerics and thieves, not to be outdone, also established their own little guilds/academies. The clerics established a temple and sanctuary in the town of Melanir, and also in the town of Melanir, the thieves founded a guild, and they also built another one in Torlin, but the one in Torlin would not survive. Normally not a big deal creating a guilds and academies, but however, since humanity had no outside threat, such as orcs or goblins threatening it, they started to focus in towards themselves. The wizards and warriors bickered over the balance of political power between the two of them. Eventually, this bickering turned into blows, and the warriors and wizards went to war. Pleas for enlistments spread beyond the rift, and mercenaries of all classes joined the battle. The major fortifications on each side were destroyed. A fighter's keep that stood in the center of a once fertile box canyon sank into the swamps that mages had conjured. That would be the Gloomfens. In return, the fighters and warriors used giant engines of war to destroy all the wizard spires and hidden retreats in the mountains. As the war continued on, the mages, sensing that they were about to lose, unleashed a killing force that altered the face of the land. There was a forest that served as a barrier between the two lands, but this was reduced into a twisted, stumpy mockery of what it used to be. Everything in the area died or mutated because of the fearsome sorcery work that day, and most of the warriors perished as their territory sank into a desolate, bubbling morass of poisonous fumes. This entire box canyon became known as the site of the Gloomfens, as I mentioned earlier. The wizards, thinking that they had achieved full victory, would continue to be cautious for probably another year, worried that the warriors may come back. They, however, did not, at least during that year. At the end of the year, the wizards had become open enough to start accepting new recruits, and an entire class of new wizards was recruited from the population. As this group of recruits was brought into Wizard Spire, these recruits showed their true allegiance as the last remaining members of the Fighters Academy, and proceeded to make their way through Wizard Spire, slaughtering any wizard they could find. It is said at the end of this, there was nothing left alive in that spire. Rumors suggest that the fighters who had accomplished this then retreated to the far south of the Thunder Rift and are still hiding out there. And that is where history ends and the present time for any campaign set in the Thunder Rift is supposed to start. The book goes on saying that there was considerable amounts of weapons caches and treasure left in all of the ruins of the warriors and the wizards, which would lead to many explorers wanting to go into them to find them. However, each of these areas is laced with traps and dangers. Only a few of these are covered by modules, so that leaves it open to a dungeon master to create any sort of setting they want to. And since it's pretty generic, you can almost port many different modules into this. Seeing as how it looks like this video is going to be going over 20 minutes, I guess I'll be doing another chapter on the major population centers of the Thunder Rift in another video. So I hope this helps somebody out there, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.